Hi there, it has been a while since I reviewed my own daily set of wheels, and that's thanks in the most part due to the fact that I had fairly unremarkable and/or unreliable bikes over the last 12 months. I had a Kawasaki ZR250, we had an XV535, otherwise known as a Virago from Yamaha. That was, I'm not going to mince words, it was a piece of shit. But I'm glad to say that has been rectified with this little beauty, my Yamaha MT-03. Bear with me, I will give you the best bits, the worst bits, and a little bit of the history of the MT-03. So why did I go for the MT-03? A few different reasons. One, because I was hoping it would fly under the radar, and it kind of does. They aren't that highly sought after for bike thieves, so hopefully it doesn't get noticed too much. It has a little bit of its own identity and style, which is somewhat important to me, and it's fairly cheap to buy, insure and run. So the MT-03, in this guise at least, with the 660cc single cylinder engine, came out in 2006 and ended its run in 2011, a relatively short run for the MT-03. It was a bit of an oddball and it never really found its market when they first came out. They didn't change anything over that time either, so if you get one from 2006, it'll be the same as the ones from 2011. There's only cosmetic differences really. The big party piece of this bike is the engine. Basically, this bike is A2 friendly, which means that this is around 45 to 47 brake horsepower and about 43 foot-pounds of torque. So it is pretty much the most amount of horsepower and torque you can get for your first bike if you have an A2 license in the UK. If you're expecting to be pulling wheelies on this thing all the time, don't worry, the torque kit isn't quite that dramatic. It's okay, I'll be honest with you, you can't necessarily power wheelie it, you would have to clutch it up, and you can pretty much just wrap it round on the throttle without being too concerned about the rear wheel spinning out or lifting the front. The engine was relatively cheap for them to find because it comes from their XT660. It is long running, long serving, and it has been tried and tested. It is a reliable engine for the most part. Now, whilst I say I really like the thumpy nature of it and the torquey power, it is also a little bit of a pig to get on with. It has this weird sort of heart flutter where basically if you change gears, it can drop the revs to a dead stall for a brief second. It will then kick itself into gear, but it does mean that you get an awful lot of engine braking immediately, which is a frustrating thing, and it sort of feels like the bike isn't happy. I have heard of other people, in fact, actually stalling the bike because of this. It can be a frustrating thing. A lot of the other pieces you find on this bike will have been stolen from the rest of their range. A lot of it from the Phaser, in fact. So the front forks, I'm led to believe, come from the Yamaha Phaser, as do the brakes. We have two piston on the front with 295mm dual discs. We have a 245mm rear disc, and again, apparently two piston. I'm not entirely sure, but I found that listed online somewhere, I believe in their own service manual. Rear suspension, honestly don't know where it comes from. I know that it's a Sachs. They're relatively good, again, tried and tested, and of course mounted horizontally on the front here. It is a nice little style element, and it's the thing that probably gets the most comments on this bike, actually, if I'm honest. All the suspension only adjustable for preload. Obviously, it's pretty bare bones basic. It is a normal kind of height, 805mm. It's not too tall for you. It's got a big fat wide seat, and that has been remarked upon by a few people. Oh, I bet that's comfortable. And the answer is no, it isn't. It's very, very stiff. It is also angled like this, which means that if you're doing long distance, as much as you try and move yourself towards the pillion seat, it will find a way of just sliding your ass closer and closer to the tank until you're doing T-Rex hands and your crotch, male or female, is pressed up against the tank in a fairly uncomfortable position. It's also obviously sit up and beg position, literally sit up and beg, because your hands are doing that. It is the most sit up and beg I've ever had on a bike. And this is lessened on mine because actually it has aftermarket bars. I've been told it's slightly worse on the stock versions. But when you're sitting up and begging, you will get a lot of wind in your face. Don't worry too much, the bike only has a top speed of about 101 miles an hour. That's very precise, isn't it? I'd say between 100 and 105, something around that. Depends what you're doing, depends if you've got a crosswind or a wind coming towards you, or you're going downhill. All of these things will affect how fast you can take the MT-03, but when you do that, you will be in 5th gear because it only has 5. You'll probably find the same as me, and I've owned this thing for a few months now, that you are constantly looking for 6th gear. That is because the gears are relatively short, or not necessarily the gears as the actual rev range. So obviously, what's it got on there? 9,000, have a little look. You can go up to 9, it red lines between, give us a moment, 7.5 and 8 obviously, so yeah, you're at 7,500 revs there. You won't really need to go this high. It's supposed to make peak around 6,000. Anything between 3 and 5 is your sweet spot. Anything under 3 and the bike will probably feel like it's going to clack itself apart. It does feel somewhat knocky when you get it below 3,000 revs. Doesn't like it. You need to tease the clutch a lot. So that brings me on to the clutch. The clutch is really quite stiff. It's probably because of the springs they use down in the clutch, which hopefully would mean that it's robust, but it also means that if you're doing town riding, your hand's probably going to get tired quite quickly. Tank capacity, 15 litres. Tank range, 100 miles to the reserve. No more, no less, ever. What's quite nice about this bike is that when the reserve comes on, just in case you miss it, it will flip over to a reserve tachometer, which will tell you how long ago the light actually came on. Just in case, like I say, you actually missed the light coming on yourself, which means you know exactly how much range you've got until the petrol station. It can be somewhat frustrating that obviously after 100 miles, you have to keep filling it up and you will have to pull over quite a lot, but that's not uncommon for a bike of this size really, is it? So we won't hold that against it. I do like this red though, isn't it nice? Isn't that pretty? Let's bring it on to faults. The only ones that I've known, and you can search this yourself online, but basically it has a very reliable engine. That XT660 engine is tried and tested. It is a big fat lump. It has no kind of nuance or finesse to it, but it will do the job perfectly well. It can be a little bit, no, scratch that, a lot agricultural, but like I say, what more do you really want from it? They have been reported to have electronic problems. If you leave it out in the wet, it won't like it. I don't know why you'd expect anything different. It is made in Italy. Ha. Vibration, that is a big one. I have experienced that. The bike does vibrate obviously quite a lot. You will see it when you start it up, everything kind of shakes. Now that leads its way to the rear. On the rear, it can loosen off the bracket on the rear here. Your number plate might fall off. The exhausts do shake around a fair amount as well. There are little bolts and screws. Anything on here that is a little bit loose will probably shake itself free if you don't tighten it up. So be careful of that. Because it's a single, because it is apparently quite thirsty, but again, I've had no such problems with mine. Some people do neglect oil changes and topping up the oil, in which case, obviously if it's been running dry, that won't do the engine any good. Just when you come to find one, start it up. If it sounds a little bit too knocky, which I'll admit can be a little bit tough to decipher on this bike because of course it is quite a lumpy single, then obviously be careful. Not to confuse you too much, you should be able to tell if it's knocking because of oil starvation or if it's just that maybe you're in the wrong gear and it doesn't quite like it. And that is pretty much it for faults. It genuinely is a solid little lump. What do I like about the bike? A few different things. One, I do like the fact that it has this trip meter. I like the fact that it is very precise in telling you when you're going to run out of fuel, because it will do it quite early. I do sort of like the fact that it's got this big wide seat. It is fairly comfortable to operate and move around. I love the fact that this engine is reliable. It is, isn't it? Really, tried and tested. I like the fact that for a Yamaha, the finish isn't too bad. It hasn't really suffered that badly, although for the majority of this bike's life, it has been kept in a garage. I like the fact that it looks quirky, and it really does look quirky. Love or hate the looks, it at least has an identity, and that is an important thing with bikes, because for me a lot of the point is that it's about expression. I like the fact that it's nippy and agile. I like the fact that it's got punchy power, perfect for a town. I like the fact that it has big wide bars. You can get an awful lot of purchase over that steering. I like the fact that for a town and at low speeds it is quite comfortable. I like the fact that it is quite light and quite maneuverable. I like the fact that it is very basic mechanics. I feel like I could fix most of the stuff on this bike without any real problems. It is a no fuss machine, and I absolutely love the fact that I come to it in the morning, press one button and the thing starts up, because I have had some very unreliable bikes in the last few months. Now, if you were to look at this bike and say that you hated it, you'd be right. And if you look at it and go, you know what, I do love it, then you'd be right as well. It is a very subjective bike. It is very polarizing as far as viewpoints go. You'll find that from the forums as well. It has an awful lot of character. Fair enough, that word is a bit of a cop-out and people use it all the time, but it does. Now, that character is either something that you absolutely hate or something that manages to worm its way in and charm you. And for me, it's charmed me. I've used this thing to go up to Wales. I've taken long trips on it. It is not made for that, but hell, it got there in the end anyway. I've used it to do some fast riding. I've used it for town and city as well. And although it's not necessarily suited to all of those things, it's kind of suited to most of them. And I always end up walking back to it with a smile on my face. I will definitely look back on this machine fondly. And even miss it. Does the job. Forgot to mention, if you haven't already subscribed, you know what to do. It's down there somewhere. Just, you know, click it. Do the thing. See you later.